My rich father-in-law tried to pay me to leave his daughter. He slid a check across his desk and sneered, "Take the 50,000 and run." I slid it back with my own bank statement. His jaw dropped when he saw the $400 million balance. That happened on a Thursday afternoon, in a mahogany-paneled office on the 43rd floor of a building in downtown Denver, Colorado. The check was in a cream-colored envelope. His initials were embossed on the front. He pushed it across the desk the way a man pushed something when he was completely confident the person on the other side would pick it up. No hesitation, no negotiation. He had already decided how this meeting ended. He had been deciding things about me since the first night his daughter brought me home for dinner 4 years earlier. He had looked at me across his dining room table, the man in the custom suit, the man with the Aspen ski house and the art collection, and the specific smooth authority of someone who had been wealthy long enough to believe it made him a better judge of people than everyone around him. And he had made his assessment in about 90 seconds. He saw a 34-year-old man in a decent but unremarkable suit. He saw someone who drove a practical car and who had calloused hands from work he had done a long time ago that the skin still remembered. He saw a man who talked about building things in a quiet, straightforward way, without the specific theatrical quality of someone who needed you to understand how significant they were. He saw someone he had already categorized. He spent 4 years trying to remove me from his daughter's life. The comments at family dinners, the specific questions about my financial situation that were framed as concern and were actually inventory. The 2 separate attempts to introduce his daughter to other men at family events while I was standing in the same room. None of it worked. So he called me to his office. He slid the check. He said, "Take the 50,000 and run. My daughter deserves better than whatever you are building over there." I picked up the envelope. I held it for a moment. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and I took out a single folded page. My most recent bank statement, current balance, the number that my accountant and my attorney and my wife knew and that nobody else in that building was aware of because I had spent 14 years building something in complete silence, while people like Douglas Holt decided who I was based on 90 seconds of observation. I unfolded it. I put it on the desk next to his check. I slid it across. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. His face went through something that I had never seen on Douglas Holt's face in 4 years of watching it perform confidence and authority, and the specific elevated disdain of a man who had always been the richest person in every room he entered. Then he looked at me. And for the first time since the dinner table 4 years earlier, he saw me. Actually saw me. What I want to tell you now is everything that happened between a boy growing up in a rented house in Roanoke, Virginia, with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who left when the boy was 9, and the man sitting in that office on the 43rd floor. Because the $400 million was never the point. It was the evidence. The point was everything that built it. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you are new here, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. New story every week. Let us go. My name is Cole Merritt, and I am 38 years old. I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, in a neighborhood that had a specific working-class texture that most people who had not grown up in it would have described as modest, and that the people who lived in it would have described more plainly as tight. Row houses on Stanton Avenue, concrete stoops, small yards with chain-link fences, the specific ambient noise of a neighborhood where most of the adults were home late and up early, and where the sound of the day starting was the sound of people who did not have the option of sleeping and heading out to the thing that needed to be done. My father, Thomas Merritt, left when I was 9. I want to say that plainly because it is the plain truth. He did not leave dramatically. He did not leave in a single event. He left the way certain men left, gradually, then completely. More evenings out, more unexplained absences, more of the specific tight quiet that settled into our house when my mother, Carol, was managing something she had decided we did not need to be carrying with her. He left on a Tuesday in March. I remember because it was a school day and I came home, and the specific quality of the silence in the house was different from ordinary silence, and my mother was in the kitchen making dinner, with the specific focused economy of movement that she had when she was working through something by doing rather than by stopping. She said, "Your father is going to be staying somewhere else for a while." I said, "Okay." She said, "Nothing changes for you. School is the same, dinner is the same, everything is the same." She meant it. She made it true. Carol Merritt was a practical woman with a genuine gift for sustaining the essential things when the peripheral things fell away. She worked as a medical records specialist at a hospital in downtown Roanoke. During the day and 3 evenings a week she cleaned offices in a commercial building on Jefferson Street. She did this without complaint. She did this with the specific efficient warmth of someone who understood that her children were watching, and that what they were watching was going to shape what they believed was possible. My sister, Denise, was 6 when our father left. She had our mother's specific quality of just continuing. She processed things internally and came out the other side with her equilibrium intact. She was not untouched by the things that happened to our family. She was not broken by them either. I was different. My response to the things that happened was to build. Not build in the dramatic visionary sense, in the 9-year-old sense of someone who needed to produce something tangible as a way of managing the specific feeling of things coming apart around him. I built models. I took apart things that did not work and tried to understand why they did not work and put them back together. I fixed things around the house that my father would have fixed: faucets, a screen door that did not close correctly, the specific mechanical patience of someone who needed the satisfaction of a broken thing becoming a working thing. Our neighbor, a retired machinist named Harold Bates, who lived 3 houses down, and who had a workshop in his basement that smelled of metal shavings and machine oil, saw me one Saturday trying to fix the chain-link gate at the side of our yard that had come off its hinge. He watched me for a while. He came over. He said, "You are trying to make it work on its own. It needs support from the post or it will keep coming off." I looked at the gate. He was right. He said, "Come to the workshop. I will show you how to do it properly." I went. I went every Saturday for 4 years. Harold had been a machinist at a railroad equipment plant in Roanoke for 31 years. He understood metal, fabrication, mechanical systems, the specific relationship between materials and forces, and the ways that relationship could be managed to produce reliable outcomes. He was not a teacher by training. He was a man who understood things completely, and who communicated that understanding by showing rather than explaining, standing back while you tried it and letting you discover what worked and what did not, and then asking questions that guided you toward understanding why. He taught me something that became the foundation of everything I built later. He said, "Most things that look complicated are just a series of simple problems stacked on top of each other. The mistake people make is trying to solve all of it at once. You take one problem at a time. You solve it completely. Then you move to the next one." I was 13 when he said this. I applied it for the next 25 years. Secondary school was the period where I started understanding that the specific skill Harold had been developing in me had a broader application than fixing gates and machining metal parts. I was good at mathematics in the specific way that came from understanding the underlying logic rather than memorizing procedures. I was good at any problem that required me to decompose something complex into its component parts and address each part in sequence. I was patient with things that required sustained attention. I was less patient with things that required performance of attention rather than actual attention. My high school had a technology and engineering program, one of the better ones in the state. Apparently, funded by a combination of state grants and private donations from regional businesses. The program director was a woman named Ms. Patricia Wheeler, who was 45, and who had a background in industrial engineering before she transitioned to teaching, and who ran the program with the specific rigor of someone who had worked in environments where things that did not work correctly had real consequences. She noticed me in my first week of the program. She pulled me aside after class and said, "Your project submission was more thorough than what I typically see from incoming students. Where did you learn to approach problems that way?" I told her about Harold. She said, "Harold Bates." I said, "You know him." She said, "He gave a guest lecture in this program 3 years ago. He is one of the better practical engineering minds in this region." She paused. She said, "He taught you well." I said, "He mostly let me figure things out and asked questions when I was wrong." She said, "That is the only teaching that actually sticks." Patricia Wheeler became the second adult outside my family who saw something specific in me and did something deliberate about it. She pushed my work to a level beyond the standard curriculum. She connected me to a regional engineering competition that I had not known existed and that I won in my junior year with a project on load-bearing optimization in small structure design. The competition came with a $5,000 scholarship. For my mother, $5,000 was a specific thing with specific implications. She sat at the kitchen table when I showed her the letter, and she read it twice, and then she put it down, and she looked at me with the expression she had when something significant had happened that she was not going to allow herself to dismiss. She said, "This is the beginning." She said it the way she said important things, plainly, with the specific weight of someone who did not use emphasis lightly, and whose emphasis therefore meant something. I said, "Yes." She said, "Work hard." She went back to the kitchen. The scholarship covered 1 year at Virginia Tech. I covered the rest through a combination of work study, a part-time job at a construction supply company near the campus in Blacksburg, and the specific financial discipline of someone who understood from childhood that money was a resource that required careful management rather than a comfort that arrived reliably. I studied civil engineering. The choice was specific and deliberate. Civil engineering was the field that was most directly connected to what Harold had been teaching me: the relationship between materials and forces, the design of structures that had to actually work under real conditions, the specific accountability of a field where a wrong answer had physical consequences rather than just academic ones. I was good at it. Not in the dramatic genius sense, in the steady, competent sense of someone who did the work completely and who was more interested in understanding things correctly than in appearing to understand them. I graduated in 2008 with an engineering degree and stepped directly into the worst economic environment for construction and infrastructure in a generation. The financial crisis had hit the construction sector with specific brutality. Companies were pulling back. Projects were being shelved. The job market for new civil engineers was the kind of job market that new civil engineers who had borrowed money for school and had a mother working 2 jobs sat in and tried to figure out what came next. I did not wait for what came next. I called Harold. I said, "Harold, I need advice." He said, "Come over." I drove from Blacksburg to Roanoke on a Saturday morning, and I sat in Harold's basement workshop where I had spent every Saturday for 4 years, and I told him about the job market and about the specific situation I was in. He listened. He said, "You have the degree." I said, "Yes." He said, "You have the skills." I said, "Yes." He said, "So the question is whether to wait for someone to hire you or to find a problem and solve it." I said, "What problem?" He said, "What did you learn to do?" I said, "Structural analysis, load optimization, small and mid-scale construction design." He said, "And what does the construction industry need right now that it is not getting from the big firms?" I thought about this. I had been working at the construction supply company near campus for 2 years. I had watched a specific pattern in how mid-sized construction contractors operated. They needed engineering analysis for their projects, but the large engineering firms were too expensive, and the smaller regional firms were too backlogged. The gap between what a mid-sized contractor needed and what they could afford was real and consistent. I said, they need affordable engineering analysis that is actually responsive to their timeline. Harold said, "That sounds like a business." I said, "I have no clients and no capital." He said, "You have skills and you have time. Those are the inputs for the first version of a business. Capital comes after the skills and time produce something worth paying for." I drove back to Blacksburg. I registered Merit Engineering Consulting as a sole proprietorship in September of 2008. My office was a desk in the apartment I shared with 2 other recent graduates. My first client came in October through a connection from the construction supply company where I worked part-time. A small residential contractor in Christiansburg named Mike Dupree, who needed a structural analysis for a renovation project and who had been quoted a 3-month wait by the regional engineering firms. I said, "I can have it in 2 weeks." He said, "How much?" I told him. He said, "That is 1/3 of what the big firms charge." I said, "I have lower overhead." He looked at me. He said, "If you mess this up, I lose the project." I said, "I will not mess it up." He hired me. I delivered in 11 days. The analysis was right. The project moved forward. Mike Dupree called me the following month with another project and referred me to 2 other contractors. I want you to understand what those first 2 years looked like, because the unglamorous version of building something is the version that produces the durable version. I worked days at the construction supply company and evenings and weekends on Merit Engineering Consulting. I slept less than was medically advisable. I ate in a way that prioritized cheapness over quality. I wore the same 3 work shirts in rotation, and I did not buy anything I did not need because everything I earned from the consulting work went back into the business. Software licenses, professional certifications, the specific continuing education that kept my analysis current with building codes and material standards that evolved continuously. By the end of 2010, the consulting business was generating enough revenue that I could leave the construction supply job. I left. By 2012, Merit Engineering Consulting had 3 full-time engineers and revenues just under $2 million. By 2014, it had 11 engineers and revenues of $6 million. But the business that produced the bank statement on Douglas Holt's desk was not the engineering consulting firm. That firm was where I learned everything. What I built with that knowledge was something different. And that is the next section. Subscribe right now and stay with me, because the next part is the turning point. The specific decision I made in 2014 that changed the scale of everything. The decision that changed everything came from a problem I kept watching without being able to fix from the outside. I want to explain it carefully because the specific logic of it is the reason the outcome was what it was rather than something else. In my engineering consulting work, I had been on the inside of hundreds of construction and development projects over 6 years. I had done the structural analysis. I had watched the projects move from concept to completion, and I had watched, project after project, the specific gap between what a development project was worth when it was planned and what it actually produced when it was complete. The gap was real and it was consistent, and it came from the same place every time. Development projects failed financially or underperformed, most often because of the financing structure rather than because of the construction quality or the market demand. The money was structured wrong. The timing of draws was wrong relative to the construction timeline. The cost projections were wrong in ways that were predictable and correctable if you understood both the construction and the finance simultaneously. Most development projects were managed by people who understood one or the other. Very few people understood both. I understood both. Not because I had finance training, I had engineering training. But 6 years of sitting inside development projects had given me a financial education that went deeper than most formal training, because it was education from real consequences. I had watched projects run out of money because the draw schedule did not match the construction progress. I had watched margin get destroyed by cost overruns that were predictable from the engineering analysis, but that the financial structure had not accounted for. I had watched projects that were fundamentally sound fail because the money was wrong. I started reading. The way I had always learned the most important things, through intensive self-directed reading of the primary sources: real estate development finance, private equity structure in development contexts, tax increment financing and opportunity zone investing, the specific mechanics of capital stacks for large commercial and mixed-use projects. I read for 8 months while I was still running the engineering consulting firm. At the end of 8 months, I had a clear picture of what I wanted to build. A development company that integrated the engineering analysis with the financing structure from the beginning, rather than as separate functions. A company that could take a development project from raw land to completed asset with full command of both what the thing was going to cost to build and how to structure the capital to make the numbers work. This was a real gap in the market. The engineering firms and the development finance firms were separate worlds. The developers who were genuinely excellent at integrating both functions were rare and were typically working at the large institutional scale, where projects were hundreds of millions of dollars, and the minimum viable deal size excluded most of the mid-market. I wanted to build in the mid-market. Not because the mid-market was more comfortable, because the mid-market was less efficiently served and therefore offered better returns for the specific skills I was bringing to it. I called a man named Robert Yamaguchi. Robert was the CFO of a regional development company in Richmond, Virginia, that I had done structural analysis for on 3 projects over the previous 4 years. He was 51, a CPA by training who had spent 20 years in real estate development finance, and who had the specific comprehensive knowledge of the field that came from having been inside the deals rather than studying them from outside. We had had lunch twice over the years, real conversations about the industry and about what the right capital structures looked like for different types of projects. He was one of the sharpest people I had encountered in the field, and he had the specific quality of someone who talked about things honestly rather than in the managed way of someone protecting a professional position. I called him on a Thursday evening. I said, "Robert, I want to have a serious conversation about building something together." He said, "I have been waiting for this call." I said, "You have?" He said, "For about 2 years. Whatever you are building in your head, Cole, it is written on your face every time we talk about these projects." We had lunch the following week. I laid out the full concept, the integrated development model, the mid-market focus, the specific operational structure, the capital strategy for the first 3 projects. Robert listened to everything. He asked 10 questions. All of them were the right questions, specific, technical, the questions of someone who understood the field well enough to know where the assumptions were doing the most work. I answered all 10. When I finished, he said, "I want to come in as a partner." I said, "What does that look like for you?" He said, "I bring the finance architecture and the capital relationships. You bring the engineering and the development execution. Equal partners in the management company, negotiated splits on individual deals based on our respective contributions." I said, "That is fair." We shook hands. Meridian Development Partners, was registered in January of 2015. Cole Merritt, Civil Engineering, Development Execution, Project Management. Robert Yamaguchi, Development Finance, Capital Structure, Investor Relations. Two people who understood things that most development companies understood separately. The first project was a mixed-use development in Charlottesville, Virginia, 42,000 square feet, retail on the ground floor, 48 residential units above, a site that had been sitting underutilized for 3 years because the previous developer had been unable to make the financing work at a cost structure that produced an acceptable return. Robert and I spent 6 weeks rebuilding the entire project model from the engineering up. What we found was what I had been watching for 6 years. The previous developer had used a conventional construction cost estimate that was 15% high for the specific site conditions and construction type, had structured the capital with a timeline that did not match the realistic construction schedule, and had modeled a lease-up assumption that the market demographics did not support. We corrected all three. The corrected model produced an acceptable return at a cost structure that made the project viable. We raised the capital in 8 weeks through Robert's existing investor relationships. We broke ground in March of 2015. We delivered in November of 2016, on time, within 3% of budget. The project sold in early 2017 at a return that significantly exceeded our initial projections. Our investors had never seen that combination on a mid-market project: on-time delivery, near-budget performance, and above-projection returns. It happened because we had not separated the engineering from the finance. The engineering informed the finance from the beginning, and the finance was structured to match the engineering reality. Word traveled. In the development world, the word that traveled fastest was the specific word about someone who delivered what they said they were going to deliver. We had 4 investors in the first project. We had 14 investors in the second. By 2019, Meridian Development Partners had completed 6 projects totaling just under $400 million in developed value, had begun 3 additional projects, and had a reputation in the mid-Atlantic and mid-market development community that was producing inbound deal flow faster than we could intelligently deploy capital into. I had not announced any of this. I want to be clear about this because it matters for the story. Merritt Engineering Consulting had been a business I had talked about when it was relevant to professional conversations. Meridian Development Partners was something I talked about with Robert, with our investors, with our project teams, and with my wife. Nobody else. My mother knew I was doing well. She asked the same question she had always asked: "Are you happy and is it real?" And I told her yes both times, and she went back to whatever she was reading. My wife, Lauren, knew everything. Lauren Holt was the daughter of Douglas Holt and Margaret Holt of Denver, Colorado. I met her in 2017. She was 32. She was a hospital administrator at a large healthcare system in Richmond, where her work had brought her from Denver after her MBA. She was there when the first Charlottesville project was under construction. I was in Richmond for 2 months managing the project, and a mutual friend had included both of us in a dinner group that met monthly. The first time I saw Lauren, she was arguing with someone about hospital operational efficiency. Calmly, with the specific engaged certainty of someone who had thought about this for a long time and had accurate information, and was going to share it regardless of whether the person she was arguing with was receptive. She was right about the argument. I said so afterward when we were both getting coffee. She looked at me. She said, "Were you listening to that whole conversation?" I said, "Yes. You were right about the throughput analysis. The bottleneck is in discharge protocol, not admissions volume." She said, "That is exactly right. How do you know that?" I said, I have done construction work in hospital facilities for years. You see a lot of operational patterns when you are in the building long enough. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "Cole Merritt." She said, "What do you do, Cole Merritt?" I said, "I build things." She said, "That is the least specific answer I have ever received to that question." I said, "I have found that the specific version makes people assess the version of me they want to deal with rather than actually dealing with me." She was quiet. Then she said, "That is either the most self-aware thing a man has ever said to me or the most calculated." I said, "Probably both." She laughed. We talked for 2 more hours. She was the most direct person I had encountered since Harold Bates. She said what she thought. She disagreed with me twice in the first hour on things where she was partially right and told me exactly why. She asked genuine questions, not the questions people asked as social mechanics, but the questions of someone who was actually curious about the answers. We had dinner the following week. We talked for 4 hours. We met for lunch the week after. By month 3, she knew what I did in the specific version because she had asked, and because keeping the specific version from her felt dishonest in a way I was not comfortable with. She listened to all of it. She said, "So when you said you build things?" I said, "That was the short version." She said, "The long version is that you run a development company with 300 million in completed projects." I said, 400 now. We closed a sale last week." She said, "And you did not tell me this for 3 months because?" I said, "Because I have found that people's understanding of who I am changes when they have that information, and I wanted you to decide who I was before you had it." She looked at me. She said, "Cole." I said, "Yes." She said, "I decided who you were in the first hour of the first dinner." I said, "What did you decide?" She said, "That you were the most straightforward person I had met in a long time in a field full of people who performed being straightforward while doing something else." She said, "The money was interesting information. It was not information that changed the decision." She was the first person outside my professional world who had ever said something like that and meant it. I knew she meant it because she said it at a dinner that was entirely ordinary. A place she had picked, a restaurant that had good food and unpretentious service, a table where neither of us was performing anything for anyone. She meant it. We got serious quickly. She was the specific combination of qualities that produced real partnership in the complete sense: direct, genuinely curious, capable of disagreeing without making the disagreement about something other than the actual disagreement. She was warm in the specific way of someone who chose when to be warm rather than deploying it as a default social setting. She also called her parents every Sunday. And in October of 2018, she told them she was bringing someone to Denver for Thanksgiving. Subscribe right now and stay with me because the next section is the Denver dinner and Douglas Holt and the first 4 years of that specific relationship. Douglas Holt owned Holt Capital Partners, a private wealth management and investment firm based in Denver with approximately $1.2 billion in assets under management. He had built it over 30 years from a smaller advisory practice he had acquired in his mid-30s. He was 66. He had the specific appearance of a man who had been significant for long enough that the significance had become invisible to him. He simply occupied the world as if it had been organized for his comfort. He was not a stupid man. He was a man whose specific intelligence had been operating in an environment where the signals it received consistently confirmed its conclusions, which over a long period of time produced the specific blindness of someone who had stopped encountering information that challenged what they already believed. He believed that wealth communicated character, that the form in which a person's success appeared communicated more than the success itself, that the right background, the right pedigree, The right professional address were meaningful signals about the kind of person someone was. He believed all of this with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years having it confirmed. He looked at me across his Thanksgiving table on the Thursday of our first visit, and he made his assessment in 90 seconds. Lauren had told them very little about me. She had told them my name. She had told them I was in real estate development. She had told them I was from Virginia. She had not told them more than that because she had watched her father operate for 32 years, and she understood that additional information would produce premature conclusions rather than genuine curiosity. He shook my hand. He said, "Real estate development in Virginia." I said, "Yes." He said, "Residential or commercial?" I said, "Primarily commercial, mixed use." He said, "What scale?" I said, "Mid-market. Our projects run between 30 and 120 million. He processed this. He said, "Regional developer." He said it with the specific inflection that communicated a category. Regional developer meant not the institutional scale, not the national REITs, not the big names he recognized. Regional developer was a category below the category he respected. I said, "Yes." He said, "Who are your capital partners?" I named two of them, real names in the development world, names that Douglas Holt should have recognized because they were significant in regional private equity circles. He showed no recognition. He had moved on. He asked Lauren about her work. He asked Margaret about the renovation on the guest house. He did not ask me another direct question for the rest of the evening. I watched him operate throughout that dinner. The way he spoke to his wife with the specific managed warmth of someone who was performing a role rather than inhabiting a relationship. The way he spoke to Lauren with the specific quality of someone who loved her genuinely, but who had made the love conditional on the version of her that confirmed his understanding of the world rather than the version that actually existed. The way he spoke to the people at the table, as if the conversation was a resource he was distributing according to who deserved the allocation. I filed all of this. I said nothing about it to Lauren. What I said when we were driving back to the hotel was, "Your father has a specific way of assessing people." She said, "Yes." I said, "He made his assessment in the first 5 minutes." She said, 2 minutes probably. I said, "Does it bother you?" She said, "Which part?" I said that he does it to everyone, including me. She looked at the Denver street. She said, "My father has spent 30 years being the most financially significant person in any room he enters. When he enters a room now, he cannot see people clearly. He can only see them in relation to where they sit on the financial hierarchy he carries in his head." I said, "And where do I sit?" She said, "Regional developer, Virginia, no recognizable institutional backing, practical car, no name he knows. You sit in the category he calls decent enough but not what my daughter deserves." I said, "That is specific." She said, "I have been watching him make that assessment for 32 years. I know the categories." I said, "And your mother?" She said, "My mother sees more than she says. She always has." I said, "Does it bother you that he thinks that?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It bothers me that he has been thinking it about everyone I have ever been interested in. It bothers me that he considers his financial assessment of someone to be a meaningful judgment of their character. It bothers me that my mother has spent 30 years managing around a man who decided everything too quickly and never looked hard enough at what he decided." She said, "It bothers me." Then she said, "But I am not living inside his assessment of things. I am living inside my own assessment, and my assessment is what brought me to this car tonight." I looked at her. I said, "Yes." She said, "Just let him be what he is. He will see it eventually." She was right. He just took longer than she expected. The next 2 years, 2019 and 2020 were the years Douglas Holt made his position on me clear through the specific methods of a man who understood power and was comfortable using it indirectly. At Christmas 2019, he had two men at the dinner table who had been introduced as old friends of the family. Both were in finance. Both were professionally successful in the way that Douglas recognized and respected. Both were single or recently single. Both were there with a specific purpose that Lauren identified before the salad course, and that she addressed by spending the evening in a conversation with me that was entirely too engaged for anyone to interrupt politely. Afterward in the car, she said, "Was that as obvious to you as it was to me?" I said, "From the placement at the table, yes." She said, "I am sorry." I said, "You do not need to apologize for something you did not do." She said, "He is going to keep doing things like this." I said, "I know." She said, "Does it affect how you feel about us?" I said, "No." She said, "Because it affects how I feel. About him. About what he thinks love is supposed to look like." I said, "Lauren." She said, "Yes." I said, "What your father thinks does not determine what we are. Your assessment determines what we are. You told me that in the car in Denver 2 years ago." She looked at me. She said, "You remember exactly what I say." I said, "You say things worth remembering." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to marry you." I said, "I want to marry you too." She said, "He is going to be a problem." I said, "I can manage Douglas." She said, "You say that very confidently for a man he is categorized as regional developer." I said, "Yes." We were engaged in February of 2020. Douglas called me. He said he wanted to meet, one-on-one, to talk about the future. He said it the way he said everything, with the specific smooth authority of someone who did not consider that the other person might have a different view of what was going to be discussed. I said, "Of course." We met at his office in Denver, 43rd floor. The view of the Rockies through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the kind of view that offices had when they were designed to communicate something about the person who occupied them. He had the check already prepared. He sat across from me. He slid it. He said, "Take the 50,000 and run. My daughter deserves better than whatever you are building over there." I picked up the envelope. I held it for a moment. I reached into my jacket pocket. I unfolded the statement. I put it on the desk. I slid it across. He looked at it. He looked at it for 30 seconds. He looked at it for a minute. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "That is my current account balance." He said, "This is?" I said, "Yes." He said, 400 million. I said, "That is the current liquid position. The total asset value under management through Meridian Development Partners is approximately 2.1 billion. Robert and I have been building it since 2015. He said, "I have never heard of Meridian Development Partners." I said, "We do not advertise. Our deal flow comes from track record and referrals." He was very still. He said, "You have been sitting at my dinner table for 2 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you never said." I said, "You never asked." He said, "I asked what you did." I said, "You asked what scale." I said, "Mid-market." You said, "Regional developer." You then asked your wife about the guest house renovation. He said nothing. I said, "Douglas, I want to be clear about something. I am not showing you this to win an argument or to embarrass you. I am showing you this because you tried to pay me to leave your daughter, and I want you to understand what you were doing when you made that decision." He said, "What was I doing?" I said, "You were making a decision about someone's character based on their apparent financial position. The same way you have been making decisions about me for 2 years. The same way you have probably been making decisions about most people in your life for 30 years. He was quiet. I said, I am going to marry Lauren. That decision is already made, and it is not available for your input at this point. What is available is the kind of relationship you have with us going forward. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means you can keep the check. It means you can meet with me as the person who is actually here rather than the person you assessed in 90 seconds at your Thanksgiving table. It means you can be Lauren's father in the full sense of that, rather than in the management sense you have been operating in. He looked at the statement on the desk. He looked at the check he had prepared. He said, I owe you an apology. I said, yes. He said, I made assumptions. I said, you made the specific assumption that a man's worth was visible in his apparent financial position. You were wrong about the assumption, and you were wrong about the position. He said, I was wrong about both. I said, yes. He looked out at the Rockies for a long time. He said, my wife told me I was wrong. I said, when? He said, the first dinner. She told me the night after. She said, Douglas, you saw what you expected to see and you missed the person sitting across from you. He said, she is usually right about people. I said, most people who pay attention are. He was quiet. He said, the 50,000. I said, keep it. Give it to something that needs it. He looked at me. He said, Cole. I said, Douglas. He said, I would like to start over. I said, that is the right call. He said it with the specific honest directness of a man who had been wrong about something significant, and who understood that there was only one correct response to being wrong about something significant. He said it without managing the delivery. It was the first time in 2 years of watching him that I saw Douglas Holt without the management. I stood. I held out my hand. He stood and shook it. He held it for a moment. He said, welcome to the family. I said, thank you. I rode the elevator down 43 floors. I called Lauren from the lobby. She said, how did it go? I said, he showed me the check. She was quiet. She said, what did you do? I said, I showed him the statement. She was quiet for longer. She said, Cole. I said, yes. She said, you have been carrying that statement around waiting for this moment. I said, I had it with me just in case. She said, for how long? I said, 6 months. She said, you knew he was going to do something like this. I said, I knew he was going to do something. He had been building toward it for 2 years. I wanted to be prepared. She was quiet. Then she said, you are the most patient person I have ever known. I said, Harold taught me, one problem at a time, solve it completely, move to the next one. She said, who is Harold? I said, come home and I will tell you. She came home. I told her about Harold. The Saturday workshops, the Stanton Avenue fence gate, the railroad equipment machinist who understood that the way to teach someone something was to let them discover it and then ask questions. She listened to all of it. She said, I want to meet him. I said, he is 81 and he still goes to the workshop on Saturdays. She said, then we go on a Saturday. We went the following month. Harold shook Lauren's hand and looked at her the way Harold looked at everything, with the patient, complete attention of someone who was actually looking rather than performing looking. He said, you have your own opinions. She said, yes. He said, and you say them. She said, always. He said, good. The people who say their opinions are the ones worth listening to. He made her coffee. They talked for 2 hours about hospital operations and the specific parallels to manufacturing efficiency that Harold had spent 30 years thinking about. I sat in the corner of the workshop and I listened. At the end, Lauren said, Harold, Cole told me you taught him that most complex problems are just simple problems stacked on each other. Harold said, that is right. She said, what do you do with a problem that looks simple and turns out to be complex? Harold thought about it. He said, you go back to the beginning and you look at what you assumed was simple that was actually not. The complexity was always there. You just did not look hard enough the first time. She looked at me. I looked at her. She looked at Harold. She said, I know someone who needed to learn that lesson. Harold said, most people do. He refilled the coffee. Subscribe right now because the next section is where Lauren and I get married and what Douglas Holt did at the wedding that nobody saw coming. Stay here. We were married in September of 2021. Lauren had specific ideas about the wedding that were characteristically her, practical in the specific things that would make it comfortable for the people we loved, particular in the aesthetic things that she had thought about for a long time, completely unbothered by the social performance aspects that consumed most wedding planning energy. She wanted it in Virginia, specifically in the Shenandoah Valley, at a property I had sourced for a development project that had not gone forward. A historic farm outside Stanton with a barn that had been beautifully restored, and that had the specific quality of a place that was genuinely old and genuinely itself, rather than designed to look that way. She said, it feels like you, the thing that was built right and held up for a long time. I said, I feel like a restored barn. She said, in the best possible way. We had 112 guests. Robert Yamaguchi and his wife. Harold Bates, who drove from Roanoke in his truck and who arrived 45 minutes early because he had been driving to places 45 minutes early for 60 years and saw no reason to change. My mother Carol, who wore the dress she had been planning to wear since Lauren and I got engaged and who stood at the front of the gathering and watched me get married with the expression of someone who had been working toward this specific moment for 30 years, without knowing exactly what form it would take. Douglas and Margaret Holt. Douglas had changed in the 8 months between the office and the wedding. The change was not dramatic. He was still Douglas, still had the specific bearing of someone who had been significant for a long time. But the bearing had been recalibrated in a way that was visible if you had been watching him closely enough. He stopped making 90-second assessments, or if he made them, he held them more loosely. He asked more questions. He listened to the answers before formulating a response. He had the specific quality of someone who had received genuinely new information and who had decided to update rather than defend. He called me twice in the months before the wedding. Not calls with agendas, calls where he asked about the business, genuine questions, the kind that communicated actual interest rather than assessment. He asked about the development model. He asked about the integration of engineering and finance that Robert and I had built. He asked about the deal flow and the capital structure of the current projects. I answered fully. He listened carefully. On the second call, he said, I want to understand something. I said, ask. He said, you have been sitting in my house for 2 years with this, and you never said. I said, you never asked. And when you did ask what I did, you categorized the answer and moved on. He said, yes. I said, I have found that the people who are genuinely interested in what I do ask follow-up questions. You did not ask follow-up questions. He was quiet. He said, my wife asked follow-up questions. I said, Margaret asked me 3 questions at the first dinner that were more specific than anything you asked in 2 years. He said, I know. He said, she told me afterward. I said, what did she say? He said, she said, Douglas, that man is building something significant and you are too busy making sure he understands where he sits on your hierarchy to ask what it is. I said she was right. He said, she is usually right. He said, Cole, I want to tell you something. I said, tell me. He said, the check was wrong. I have been thinking about it for 8 months and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The 50,000 was not about Lauren. It was about me. It was about managing something I was afraid of, which was that my daughter had found someone I could not assess correctly and whose being there meant I had been wrong about something important. I said, yes. He said, I am not good at being wrong about important things. I said, most people are not. He said, I have spent 30 years in a position where being wrong about important things had consequences I could see and measure. The consequence of being wrong about you was different, harder to see, harder to measure. I said, what was the consequence? He said that everything I thought I understood about how to see people was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else? I sat with that. I said, Douglas, your framework for seeing people based on their financial position is wrong. That part is accurate, but the capability underneath the framework, the ability to assess risk, to understand what a business or a situation actually is, to make judgments under uncertainty, that capability is real and it built something real. He said, it built the wrong thing in your case. I said, it built an incomplete picture. You had information I had not given you and that your framework was not asking for. That is a different problem from being wrong about everything. He was quiet. He said, you are being generous. I said, I am being accurate. He said, those are different things. I said, sometimes they are the same thing. At the wedding, Douglas gave a toast. Short, 8 sentences. I want to say that because his specific brevity was itself significant for anyone who had watched him operate in rooms where he usually occupied a great deal of the verbal space. He said, I made an assessment of Cole Merritt when he first sat at our dinner table. I was wrong in every way that mattered. He knew I was wrong. He waited for me to figure it out on my own because he is the kind of person who gives you the chance to arrive at the right conclusion rather than delivering it. Lauren has known since the beginning who she was choosing. I am grateful she chose someone who was patient enough to let her father catch up. He raised his glass. He sat down. Margaret put her hand on his. Carol, sitting at the table next to Harold, looked at me across the room with the expression she had at the competition where I won $5,000. The expression of someone who had been watching something build toward a moment for a long time and who was now in the moment. Harold was looking at the restored barn ceiling with the patient attention of a man who appreciated structural integrity in all its forms. Lauren took my hand. She said, you got him. I said, he got himself. She said, that is what you do. You set up the situation and then you let the situation do the work. I said, Harold's method. She said, yes, and Harold's method built a company worth $2 billion. I said, and got me to this barn. She said, the barn is the better achievement. I said, yes. It was. Stay right here for the final section, because the last part is about what Meridian became after the wedding, and about a specific conversation Robert and I had about what came next. The years after the wedding were the years that confirmed everything the previous decade had been building toward. Not in the dramatic sense of a single moment where the scale tipped and everything changed at once. In the slow compounding sense of good decisions, producing good outcomes that produce the conditions for better decisions. Meridian Development Partners in 2022 closed on its largest single project to date, a mixed-use development in Nashville, Tennessee, that represented $160 million in total development cost, and that was the most complex project the company had undertaken in terms of the capital structure. I want to tell you about this project specifically because it illustrates the thing that was genuinely different about what Robert and I had built. The Nashville site was a former industrial property that had been sitting in legal and regulatory complexity for 6 years. Multiple ownership interests, Environmental remediation requirements, a zoning situation that required city council approval for the intended mixed-use development. Previous developers had looked at the site and walked away because the complexity was too concentrated in one place. Robert and I spent 3 months doing what we had done on every project since the first one in Charlottesville. We decomposed the problem. Not the development problem in the abstract, the specific problem. What exactly was the ownership complexity, and what was the legal path to clean title? What exactly was the environmental remediation requirement, and what did it cost and how long did it take, and could that cost and timeline be integrated into the project capital structure in a way that produced an acceptable return? What exactly was the zoning situation, and what was the specific political and procedural path to council approval? One problem at a time, solve it completely, move to the next one. Harold's method applied at a $160 million scale. The ownership complexity resolved in 60 days through a structured buyout that Robert had architected. The environmental remediation came in at a cost 20% below the environmental firm's initial estimate because I had done the engineering analysis of the site conditions and identified that the contamination was more contained than the preliminary assessment had suggested. The zoning approval came through in month 7 because Robert had built relationships with 2 council members who were the specific people whose questions determined the vote and who had been given detailed, honest answers to those questions over 5 months of engagement. We broke ground in month 8. We delivered 22 months later. The project sold in March of 2024 at a return that was the best of any single project Meridian had completed. Robert called me after the closing. He said, "We need to talk about what comes next." I said, "I know." He said, "The institutional investors are circling." He meant the large institutional capital, pension funds, endowments, the specific pools of capital that moved at the scale above where Meridian had been operating. They had been paying attention to our track record for 2 years. Robert had been fielding calls. We had been having the internal conversation about whether to open the door. I said, "What is your read?" He said, "We can raise a fund that positions us for projects at 300 to 500 million each. The capital is available. The deal flow is there. The question is whether we can execute at that scale without losing what makes us work at this scale." I said, "What makes us work?" He said, "The integration. The fact that the engineering informs the finance from the first day, and the finance is structured to match the engineering reality. At this scale, we would need to add people to both functions. The question is whether the people we add maintain the integration or whether they silo it." I said, "It depends on how we hire and how we structure." He said, "Yes, it always depends on that." We talked for 4 hours. The outcome of the conversation was a decision to raise a fund, but to do it at our own pace and with our own terms, investor terms that required patient capital, and that excluded the short-duration money that pressured development timelines in ways that produced the structural problems we had been fixing in other people's projects for a decade. We turned down 3 institutional investors before we found the right ones. The right ones were the ones who asked questions, the ones who understood the development model well enough to ask the specific questions about how the engineering and finance integration actually worked, the ones who were interested in the track record because of what it said about the method rather than just because of the return numbers. We closed the fund in January of 2025. $750 million. The target project pipeline that the fund was designed to support was 4 projects over 3 years at an average development cost of $220 million each. I called my mother the morning the fund closed. She answered the way she always answered, immediately, with the specific alert quality of someone who had spent decades being available when her children called. I said, "Mom, She said, Cole. I said, the fund closed this morning. She said, how much? I told her. She was quiet. She said, are you happy with it? I said, yes. She said, is it real? I said, yes. She said, okay. She said, are you eating? I said, yes, Mom. She said, Renata is keeping you fed. I said, Lauren. She said, Lauren, yes, good. She said, your father would be surprised. She said it simply, the way she said most true things. I said he would. She said, I am not surprised. She said it the same way. I said, I know. She said, I have known since you fixed that gate. I said, the gate on Stanton Avenue. She said, Harold called me. A month after you started going to his workshop, he called me and he said, Carol, your son is going to build something important. I do not know what, but I can see it in how he approaches a problem. I said, Harold called you. She said, Harold called me. I said, he never told me that. She said, he was not the kind of man who told you what he thought about you. He showed you by what he gave you. I sat with that. She said, come visit. I said, Lauren and I will come next month. She said, bring food. I said, yes. We visited the following month. Lauren brought food, the specific meal she had been making since we married that had become our Sunday dinner tradition, a Shenandoah Valley-style pot roast that took all afternoon, and that had the specific quality of something made by someone who understood that the time was the point. Carol ate 2 servings. Lauren sat with her for 3 hours after dinner, and they talked with the specific ease of 2 people who had already decided they were going to be close and were simply getting there. I went to Harold's workshop. He was there, 83 years old and still in the workshop on Saturday, because he had been going to the workshop on Saturday for 60 years, and he saw no reason to change. He was working on a small metal piece that I could not identify from the doorway. I came in. He looked up. He said, how is the business? I said, we closed a $750 million fund last week. He nodded. He went back to the piece. I sat on the stool in the corner where I had sat every Saturday for 4 years, when I was 11 through 15. He worked. The workshop smelled of metal shavings and machine oil. After a while he said, what is the piece you are working on now? I said, the piece is how to build the next phase without losing what makes the current phase work. He said, you know how to do that? I said, yes. He said, then what is the question? I said, the question is whether to trust the method at the larger scale. He put down his tools. He looked at me. He said, Cole, when you fixed that gate on Stanton Avenue, first time you tried, what did you do wrong? I said, I tried to make it work independently. I didn't give it the support from the post. He said, and when you understood what was wrong? I said, I fixed the support and the gate worked. He said, the gate is the same gate. The method is the same method. The scale is different. I said, yes. He said, the scale is not the variable that changes whether the method works. The method works because it is right. The method works at any scale where you apply it correctly. He picked up his tools. He went back to the piece. I watched him work. The Saturday afternoon quiet of the workshop that had been the background of the most important years of my education. I sat there for 2 hours. I went back to Carol's house. Lauren was in the kitchen helping my mother with something. I stood in the doorway and I watched the 2 most important people in my life after Robert talking with the easy warmth of people who had decided they were family and who were acting accordingly. This was what the $750 million was for. Not the number. What the number made possible. The Sunday visits, the workshop on Saturdays, the pot roast that took all afternoon, The specific ease of people who had enough that the enough was not the primary thing in the room anymore, and the actual people could be the primary thing. That was the point. That had always been the point. The bank statement on Douglas Holt's desk had $400 million on it. That is a large number. It is a number that took 14 years to build from a desk in a shared apartment in Blacksburg, Virginia, where a 22-year-old engineer with a part-time job at a construction supply company had decided to find a problem and solve it rather than wait for someone to offer him a position. The number is real. The number is also the least interesting part of the story. The interesting part is Harold telling me that most complex problems are just simple problems stacked on each other. The interesting part is Carol making dinner every night after 2 jobs and never once suggesting that what was available to us was a ceiling rather than a floor. The interesting part is Robert asking the right 10 questions at lunch in Richmond, and then building something together that neither of us could have built separately. The interesting part is Lauren telling me in a car in Denver that she had already decided who I was, and the money was not information that changed the decision. The interesting part is Douglas Holt sitting across from me in his 43rd floor office with the Rocky Mountains behind him and a check he had just slid across his desk, and looking at a number that reorganized everything he had believed about the 90-second assessment he had made at his Thanksgiving table 2 years earlier. He asked me afterward, at the wedding, at dinner, in one of the specific real conversations we had developed the habit of having. He asked me what I had felt when I walked into his office that Thursday. I said clear. He said not angry. I said anger would have been a waste. I was clear about what the situation was and what the correct response to it was. Anger produces noise. Clarity produces the right action. He said, Harold taught you that. I said, Harold showed me. Every Saturday for 4 years. The problem is what it is. You understand it completely. You address it correctly. You move to the next one. He said, and I was the problem. I said, you were the incorrect assumption that needed correcting. He said, with a bank statement. I said, with the information you were missing. The check was based on incomplete information. The statement completed the information. He said, and now? I said, now we start from the complete information. He said, yes. He is different now. Not completely different. He is still Douglas. He still has the specific confident authority of someone who has been significant for a long time. He still makes assessments quickly, but he holds them more loosely. He asks more questions. He listens to the answers before he decides. Margaret told Lauren that she has watched Douglas talk about the development business with a specific engaged interest that she had not seen him apply to anything outside his own field in 30 years. Lauren told me. I said he is curious about it. She said he is curious about you. She said he is trying to understand how he missed it for 2 years. I said the method was invisible. I was not performing anything at his dinner table. I was just there. And people who are just there do not read clearly to someone who is looking for the performance. She said that is what he is figuring out. I said yes. She said he said something to me last week. I said what? She said, he said, Lauren, I spent 30 years being the most financially significant person in every room I entered. And in those 30 years, I became completely unable to recognize significance that looked different from mine. She said, and then he said, Cole looked different from mine. I dismissed him. And then he showed me the statement and I understood that I had been wrong about the entire framework. She said, and then she paused and she said, and then he said, do you know what the worst part is? I said, what? She said, he said the worst part is that your mother knew from the first dinner. She told me that night, and I was so confident in my own assessment that I did not listen. I sat with that. Lauren said, He is going to be fine, Cole. I said he was always fine. He just had the wrong framework. She said, and now? I said, now he is updating the framework. She said, because of you. I said, because of the statement. She said, the statement was you. She was right. The statement was the evidence. I was the thing the statement was evidence of. 14 years of building in complete silence while people made their assessments and moved on. 14 years of one problem at a time, solved completely, moving to the next one. 14 years of my mother's specific quiet certainty and Harold's Saturday workshops and Robert's 10 right questions and Lauren's clear-eyed decision from the first dinner about who I was. The number on the statement was the result of all of those things. The number was real. Everything that produced it was more real. If you are building something right now that the people around you cannot see because it looks different from what they expect success to look like, keep building. The statement comes. The moment comes. And when it does, you want to be standing there with 14 years of real work behind you rather than with a 90-second performance. Build the real thing. Harold is right. Most complex things are just simple things stacked on each other. Take them one at a time, solve them completely, move to the next one. That is all it is. That is everything it is. Hit that like button if this story meant something to you. Subscribe to this channel, new story every single week, and everyone is worth the time. Drop a comment and tell me something. Tell me about the thing you are building that looks different from what people expect. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me the name of your Harold. I read every comment, every single one. Thank you for being here.